Hello, I'm Darren Jackal. I'm in my studio. I talk about product development, design, and mountaineering. Welcome to another episode of Experimental Design, Discourse, and Disclosure. Past few episodes, I've done a series on footwear and my interest and research into footwear design. And today I decided I'm going to just extend that into one more episode, and we'll talk about how those ideas may be used in a ski setting. So when it comes to skiing, I'm going to probably need to provide a little bit of background about my own history of it. Everyone has their own journey in the mountains and their own influences. Some of my major influences would be my parents, who were both skiers. My dad had a rink, flooded the backyard, so we were on skates and skis since, my first memories. Another thing that was important is that I was exposed to Powder magazine, and this led to a lifelong interest in powder skiing. Also in those first editions of Powder magazine that I saw were this concept of touring. Now, around the same time, guys like Sylvain Soudan and Patrick Vaillancourt and Jean-Marc Boivin in Europe were doing extreme skiing. They were hard snow skiers. In America, guys like Scott Schmidt and Glenn Plake in Greg Stump's movies, Blizzard of Oz, which came out in 1988. And that might have been a direction for myself if it hadn't have been for these guys. So this is Chick Scott, Charlie Locke, Don Gartner, and Liskey, I believe. Anyways, you can see what these guys have got going on here. They have touring skis, 3-pin bindings, long skinny skis, and they're doing these traverses. And so if it wasn't for these guys and their influence on me, I probably would have never gotten into the backcountry skiing. Once I got into backcountry skiing and I started my degree in outdoor pursuits, I got into mountaineering and alpine climbing. And although I telemarked for 20 years, I eventually saw the issues with it, especially the new telemark norm. It came along, what a disaster it was, and so then I switched to Dynafit bindings. Past 20 years I've been on Dynafit, and I've gotten much more into actually summiting on my skis. When it comes to the mountains, it seems that there are always going to be debate around different activities, like the bolting debate, Reinhold Messner carrying courage in your rucksack, Mark Twight criticizing Vail and minimizing hard alpine into sort of a roadside attraction. There's always going to be controversy and debate around certain activities, and that goes for ski mountaineering. Now, I'm of the opinion, and it's just an opinion, that putting ski in front of the word mountaineering does not change what mountaineering is. And for me, mountaineering means attaining the summit. Your intention is to get to the top. So if you are intending to get to the top of a mountain and you have skis with you, then you can say you are ski mountaineering, and that's as far as it goes for me. I have my quiver here, which is 2 pairs of skis, and then the third pair over there, which is my cross-country skis that I use when conditions are terrible and avalanche condition is high. These are what I consider to be a spring mountaineering ski, and these are the skis I would use when I'm hunting and then farming powder, so more of a winter ski. Both of them are pretty narrow for today's standards. These are like 78 underfoot, and this is like 92. And how I decide on the width of my ski is that I don't want a ski that is actually wider than my boot sole. I want to be able to ski mountaineer with all my skis, and to me, the more important part of ski mountaineering is the hard snow and being able to get an edge when it's necessary. When I was developing the conceptual footwear for summer mountaineering, I was also thinking of applications for winter mountaineering and skiing. Because I was a telemark skier and I found that it was super beneficial in developing many skills for skiing, I felt that I wanted a system that would allow me to telemark ski, so flex at the metatarsal phalangeal, but to also lock my heel down in other conditions. So what I was working on was a system that used the same idea of breaking the foot into 3 segments. So instead of one solid rigid segment, we would have a toes segment articulating with the forefoot segment that would also articulate with the rear foot segment. And I would use the joints that I have already shown you here. So the boot's going to have 3 different ways it can be operated. It would be fully flexed or fully relaxed in terms of having motion at all of the joints unencumbered. And then I would have a system where I would flip a lever and I would go to spring tension, like an old school telemark system, and that would put all the joints under slight tension, and you would be able to adjust that. The third would be a full lockout. The easiest way for me to describe what I'm thinking about the binding system is to use a Dynafit or a Dynafit, depending on where you come from, system that I would incorporate into my own binding system. So the front, the pins allowing the touring option, that makes sense, and I wouldn't change anything. What my idea is to take the other pin portion of the Dynafit binding, the one that holds the rear foot down. It's not designed for pivoting, it's just designed to hold it down. And it's comprised of this little fitting here. So what I'm thinking of doing, and I'm just going to use the back side of this ski, is to have the same binding for the toe, but I want to embed into the sole 2 of these. One up at the front here, that's going to be connected to the toe section, and another one back here that's going to be part of the heel section. So I'm going to have one here and one here, and this sole is broken into 3 parts. This is a little the worse for wear. The chuck slipped, I got lazy in my machining. Anyways, this is a system. This is extra for chucking. It would all be milled down, and it would be about that thick, and it would run underneath your foot. And there would be system where it's in neutral position, and then the next position would be where it goes forward and locks out your forefoot section. And then it would go back, and this thing would be double-ended on a plate that could be moved into the rear foot section. So now you've got hold down for downhill skiing, you've got neutral for free pivot touring, and then with the same system in its forward position, you would have toe lockout. One last look at the system, looking through the snow, through the ski, onto the sole of the boot. In this system, we are in tour mode. That means the toe is free to move at the Dynafit binding. This is a system I'm going to talk about later. And the boot itself is in completely relaxed mode, meaning there's no tension on any of the systems that would lock it down. Next is for me to flip a lever here, pulling my binding forward and engaging the front Dynafit rear heel system and locking down the forefoot. I would then move my boot into the secondary system, putting it under spring tension. This would be like the same kind of springs you see in a typical telemark binding. It would allow you to still flex at the metatarsal phalangeal, so you could drop knee, do telemark, but you would have a certain amount of resistance bringing your heel back down, etc. Third position would be to have the binding pulled into the rear pins that are part of the rear foot section or the heel section. That would lock the heel down to the ski. I would then put the boot into full lockdown mode, immobilizing all the joints. So now you're in full downhill ski system. This is an idea I have for a ski brake and a crampon system that folds up and also provides you with some edges for when you're in steep, hard snow and you really need to get some purchase. Just a few words on telemark style and telemark equipment. This is an old pair of Chouinard Tua skis from '89, skinny, 60 millimeters or less underfoot, 200 centimeters long. This has got what I think is a chili binding on it with a cable. Original telemark bindings just had pins and a clamp.
and that was what held your boot onto the ski. So the binding had one feature, and that was to clamp the boot onto the ski. And the boot was then required to provide all the other structure and mechanisms for using telemark technique. That changed when they started putting a cable around the boot to pull it into the binding and got rid of the pins. This is, to me, the wrong direction to go. Once you start requiring the binding to provide what the boot used to provide, you now are starting to complicate the binding. And what you'll see is that putting a cable that crosses beneath a joint or multiple joints is going to complicate the system. And this is where these bindings, in my opinion, go wrong. You should separate the binding. It should just do one thing, and that is to clamp your boot onto the ski. And because the cable crosses below the bellows joint on telemark boots, it's going to have to accommodate that difference in the axis of rotation of your foot and how these cables are directed below it. So that's a moment arm. So you need this cable in the back to stretch to take up for that. Now, in my idea, you isolate the toes. You do not cross a joint axis with the binding system, and it's the boot that is now required to provide all of those, the structure and the mechanisms to provide the stability and the support. The binding is just going to hold your boot down, and it's going to release when you want it to. By putting the duck butt under here on the new telemark norm and then having your system clamped to it, you're now complicating things because it crosses that joint axis. And honestly, it's, to me, the wrong way to go. That's it. No one gives a shit that you telemark.
All right, that's going to wrap it up for this episode on footwear and footwear ideas for general mountaineering, ski mountaineering, and I reviewed it. It's, about as bad as it can get, but that's fine. I just need to produce this stuff and get it out there. It's about disclosure for me. So anyways, I'm Darren Jackal. I'm in my studio. I talk about design, product development, and mountaineering. Thanks again for stopping by. This has been another episode of Experimental Design, Discourse, and Disclosure.